You're watching someone make the same mistake for the third time. You think, how can they not see it? How can experience teach them nothing? But here's what the research suggests. For some people, the learning system itself works differently. This is the psychology of people. And today we're exploring something that challenges everything you thought you knew about learning and personality. When you hear the word psychopath, you probably picture the same thing. Cold eyes, calculating mind, the predator who feels nothing. It's become almost a cliché at this point. But what if that picture is wrong? Not completely wrong, but incomplete in ways that matter. What if psychopathy isn't one thing at all? New research in Translational Psychiatry reveals that different psychopathic traits disrupt learning in completely different ways, and that distinction changes everything. Beast. Let's establish something important. Psychopathy affects roughly 1%. About 4% of corporate executives score high on psychopathic traits. In prison populations, that number jumps to 25%. Traditional views portrayed psychopaths as simply broken, lacking conscience, lacking empathy, lacking the basic wiring that makes us human. But emerging research tells a different story. Researchers now understand that psychopathy isn't monolithic. It breaks down into at least 3 distinct dimensions, each with its own cognitive signature. Let me walk you through them. The first dimension is antisocial traits, impulsivity, irresponsibility, the chronic pattern of violating social norms. And here's what the research found about how this affects learning. People high in antisocial traits perceive the world as more volatile and unpredictable than it actually is. Their brains are essentially overestimating chaos at every turn. Think about what that means. If the world seems random and unpredictable, forming stable associations between actions and outcomes becomes nearly impossible. Cause and effect blur together. Why did that relationship fail? Random. The second dimension is interpersonal traits. The grandiosity, the superficial charm, the manipulative behavior. This one disrupts learning in a completely different way. People high in interpersonal traits show blunted reward learning. The pull of rewards, the motivation that drives most human behavior, simply doesn't grip them the same way. When rewards don't register with the same intensity, the behavioral feedback loop weakens. You're less likely to repeat actions that led to positive outcomes because those outcomes didn't feel that positive. The third dimension, affective traits, might be the most revealing. This includes shallow affect, lack of remorse, the emotional flatness that defines the classic psychopath image. Is one expressive latus of fly some flux fortage hp flatch if fly some flux wire. And here's where it gets really interesting. People high in affective traits show weakened punishment learning, but their reward learning stays relatively intact. They're drawn toward rewards normally. They learn from positive outcomes. But the brake pedal, the part that learns from pain and negative consequences, doesn't work as well. This asymmetry explains something crucial. These individuals aren't incapable of learning. They learn just fine from rewards. It's the punishments that fail to register. Now, here's where this research gets provocative. Some scientists are starting to view these traits not as deficits, but as adaptations, calibrated responses to specific environments. A 2024 study in personality and individual differences found that subclinical psychopathy strengthens the link between childhood trauma and what researchers call fast life history strategies. Fast life strategies prioritize immediate rewards over long-term planning. And in environments that are genuinely unpredictable or dangerous, this approach might actually make sense. The study suggests that for those who experience severe early difficulties, certain dark personality traits may function as adaptive mechanisms for survival. Not pathology. Adaptation. This framing is controversial, and for good reason. It risks normalizing harmful behavior. It could be used to excuse accountability. Those are real concerns. But understanding the developmental origins of these traits might be essential for prevention and intervention. You can't treat what you don't understand. Research published in the Egyptian Journal of Neurology, Psychiatry and Neurosurgery confirms that childhood maltreatment, physical and emotional abuse is a significant risk factor for developing psychopathic traits, particularly the antisocial dimensions. The very trait that makes the world seem chaotic may develop in response to a world that actually was chaotic. Here's the logic. If your early environment was genuinely unpredictable, if the rules kept changing, if trust got you hurt, then perceiving volatility everywhere isn't paranoia, it's calibration. And that's the tragedy here. A survival strategy that made sense at 5 might become a prison at 30. The adaptation outlives the environment that created it. Now, let's talk about the successful psychopath. Because not everyone with these traits ends up in prison. Some end up in corner offices. And 2020 research helps explain why. The key isn't having fewer psychopathic traits. It's having better impulse control layered on top of them. The charm without the chaos. The fearlessness without the recklessness. These individuals can still manipulate. They still feel reduced empathy, but they've developed compensatory mechanisms that keep them on the right side of the law. There's ongoing debate about whether successful psychopaths represent a distinct variant, or whether they're simply the ones who haven't been caught yet. The research is still evolving. What we do know is that individuals high in psychopathic traits show consistent deficits in adapting behavior to avoid negative consequences. The punishment learning mechanism has anomalies. And here's the practical implication. Traditional deterrence strategies, threat of punishment, negative consequences, may be fundamentally less effective for these individuals, not because they're defiant, because the signal doesn't fully register. So what does this mean for you? Here's something worth considering. When dealing with someone who seems unable to learn from punishment, from consequences, the failure might not be willful. Their cognitive architecture may process that information differently. Understanding this doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior, but it might change how you approach the situation. Research suggests that reward-based approaches might work better than punishment-based ones for people high in affective traits. For those high in antisocial traits, who perceive chaos everywhere, clear, consistent structures might help. Not stricter rules. And for interpersonal traits, where rewards don't pull as strongly, the research points toward finding intrinsic motivators rather than external ones. What genuinely engages them? Start there. Here's another practical insight. Recognizing that psychopathy breaks down into distinct dimensions means you can predict behavioral patterns more accurately. Someone high in interpersonal traits will charm you. Someone high in antisocial traits will act impulsively. Someone high in affective traits won't be moved by your warnings. Different patterns, different responses needed. And perhaps most importantly, this research reminds us that personality shapes cognition in profound ways. The same world looks different through different nervous systems. We tend to assume everyone processes experience roughly the same way. The research on psychopathy shows just how wrong that assumption can be, and it likely extends far beyond clinical populations. Your learning systems, how you weigh rewards, how you register punishments, how volatile the world seems, these aren't neutral instruments. They're shaped by genes, by experience, by everything you've survived. 2024 research in Science Direct found that psychopathy-related learning deficits become more pronounced under processing load. When the cognitive system is stressed, the cracks show more clearly. This suggests something important. The differences aren't always obvious. Under normal conditions, many high psychopathy individuals navigate the world just fine. It's when things get complicated that their systems fail differently. If this kind of research interests you, the hidden architecture of how we learn and adapt, hit subscribe. We explore stories like this every week, looking at what the science actually shows. There's still so much we don't understand about psychopathy. The debate over nature versus nurture continues. The question of moral responsibility remains philosophically thorny, but the research is getting more precise. Instead of asking what is psychopathy, we can now ask, which psychopathic trait and what specific cognitive process does it affect? 3 dimensions. 3 different disruptions. Antisocial traits overestimate volatility. Interpersonal traits undervalue rewards. Affective traits underweight punishment. Same label, different mechanisms entirely. And understanding those differences might be the key to better interventions, better predictions, and, honestly, better compassion for people whose brains work differently than ours. Because here's the thing that gets lost in the conversation about psychopathy. These are human beings. They were children once. Many of them were hurt children. Their brains adapted to survive circumstances most of us can't imagine, and now they live in a world where those adaptations cause harm to themselves and others. That's not an excuse. It's context. And in psychology, context is everything. The cold predator is a real phenomenon, but it's not the whole story. Behind the mask, there are learning systems doing exactly what they were shaped to do, in environments where they no longer fit. I'm your host. Thanks for thinking with me. And remember, the human mind is stranger and more varied than we ever imagined.